Selections from Letters, Part 2. 14. Love for the Holy Fathers. To Dr. Alexander Calomiros, February 25th, Second Sunday of Great Lent, 1974. We have received your letter concerning evolution, for which we thank you very much. I have read it, trying, as you said, to remove all Western conceptions from my mind. I hope, if God gives me the strength, to study your points carefully and write you a very long and detailed reply before too long, but for the present I wish to say only a few things. I myself have been searching the Holy Fathers for some time, seeking to find out their teaching on the questions which are raised by evolution. I have been compiling a great many passages from their writings, including most of the passages which you quote in your letter. I have tried very hard not to project into these passages any preconceived opinions of my own, but I must acknowledge that my conclusions regarding the teaching of the Holy Fathers are quite different from yours. I believe that I can show you that some of your interpretations of the Holy Fathers are incomplete, that is, that you have presented only a part of their teaching and have overlooked other parts that are quite essential to the question. I would also like to present to you patristic texts on questions which you do not raise in your letter, but which I believe are also quite essential for understanding the questions raised by evolution. I note also in your letter that your use of the term evolution is somewhat imprecise, and I would like to discuss this question also in some detail. I agree with you that this subject is vital and extremely important. We have found very few people who are willing or able to think clearly on this subject, with the result that there is much confusion in the minds of Orthodox faithful concerning it. We are therefore very grateful to you for writing your views so clearly and outspokenly. Like you, we also do not want to have merely our own opinion on this subject, but only wish to accept the teaching of the Holy Fathers. So far, we have not found any evolutionists or anti-evolutionists who sets forth the real Orthodox teaching on this subject, and that is why we ourselves have been making research on it. The Protestant fundamentalist objections to evolution are mostly superficial and rationalistic, as you yourself have noted, being based on an interpretation of the book of Genesis that comes from common sense and not from the Holy Fathers. We are not theologians, and I will tell you frankly that we distrust people who call themselves theologians, for almost all of them seem to us to be just academic rationalists, but we dearly love the Holy Fathers and wish to live by their teaching, and we sense that you do also. May it be that by this love, with the help of God and by the prayers of these Holy Fathers, we may now begin a dialogue with you that will bring us all to the true patristic teaching and be of help also to others. Everything that I write will be read and criticized by my collaborator, Father Hermann, to whom I am in obedience, and we will try also to obtain the opinions of some of our Russian theologians whom we respect. 15. The Power of this World and its Fashionable Ideas. To A.Y., March 2nd, 15th, 1974. I have almost finished my reply to Dr. Calomiros, and I think God has helped me to put all the patristic material, or almost all, I have been collecting into a coherent presentation, and much more effectively than if I had gone ahead with the sober and objective presentation I had planned on. One of the Egyptian elders once said to St. John Cassian, roughly, "I'm glad you expressed this question so stupidly, because now I can clearly set forth the true doctrine." Calomiros has expressed stupid evolutionism so well, which other Greeks are afraid to do openly, that the reply to him almost writes itself. Although I know the fathers only poorly, still their doctrine touching on evolution is so clear once one puts it all together, that I am simply amazed at the power evolution has over even educated Orthodox minds. Such is the power of this world and its fashionable ideas. I will send you a copy of my letter and Calomiros' letter also when I finish typing it. It is almost twice as long as Calomiros' letter to us and will probably be 40 printed pages. Of course, now that I've done this, I don't quite know what relation this letter has to our projected book, which is absolutely necessary to get out. It may be that the book might be most effective precisely in this latter form, only somewhat revised and divided up into chapters, and with all your scientific and philosophical material entered at the appropriate places. You will notice that I mention this material at various points of the letter without going into it, as the letter is almost entirely patristic. Anyway, see what you think once you read the letter, and we will also see what Calomiros replies. Of course, many people will be upset that the evolution question is raised again and not kept quiet, but we agree with Calomiros that it should be raised and the true patristic teaching set forth. There is something very unsound about wishing to keep quiet about a question which remains so confused in most Orthodox minds. Pray for us. Today I hope to finish the last and most important section of the letter to Calomiros concerning the nature of man, on which Calomiros has expressed something perilously close to Augustinianism, based on a very wrong interpretation of the words of Saint Seraphim of Sarov. 16. Unknowingly Harboring Modern Ideas. To A.Y., March 9th, 22nd, 1974. The objective scientific approach is very necessary, not enough to get bogged down in scientific proofs, but just enough to show that the scientific proofs cancel each other out, as it were, leaving the question of evolution in its real sphere of philosophy and theology. The weakness of evolution as science and philosophy will only serve to emphasize the importance of the patristic view, which is so definite and really powerful. By the way, I begin to see that I myself have been harboring some modern ideas on the 6 days of creation. It is true that this is not the most important question involved with evolution, but it's not really a matter of indifference either. There is a profound patristic teaching in this, as I indicate in my letter to Calomiros, but it would be good to have further patristic testimony on this, so please say if you know of any. We will continue to collect patristic material for the final version of the book. 17. Genuine Science. To A.Y., St. Thomas, Tuesday, April 10th, 1974. For my own background, I checked out 2 books in the Reading Library. Raymond Dart's In Search of the Missing Link, which looks to be too popular to be of much use, and Louis Leakey's Adam's Ancestors, to which I find myself, after a few chapters, rather sympathetic, inasmuch as it seems to be rather careful and precise scientifically. Of course, if one discounts the attempt to fit all the evidence into an evolutionary framework, which does indeed seem to be a philosophical intrusion. I've come across several references to the fluorine dating system, but no thorough discussion of it. Leakey mentions it as being in its infancy in the 1940s. It has to do apparently with the rate of absorption of fluorine, which seems to be vastly variant depending on moisture, etc. It would be good for us to give a kind of philosophy of the dating systems, that is, showing that we do not reject them outright, but that their significance is relative and limited, somewhat helpful in the genuine study of paleontology, which we should also emphasize is a legitimate science, but not any absolute answer to anything. In general, we should communicate a very friendly feeling toward genuine science. 18. Clearing up confusion. To AY, August 2nd, 15th, 1974. I will be working on the final patristic section this fall, and God willing the whole study will be complete by the time Calomiros sends his promised reply, which should give us all the patristic arguments of the supporters of evolution, making our study as complete as possible. I think the impact of this study will be considerable. I do not think most conscious Orthodox Christians are terribly prejudiced in favor of evolution, but they are somewhat confused as to what or how much to believe of what science says. Our study is supposed to give the complete picture, which hopefully will clarify many minds. It certainly clarified my own mind, since previously I hadn't thought in detail on many aspects of the question. 19. The Genealogies of Christ. To AY, September 22nd, October 5th, 1974. We received the 2 sections on evolution. Christian evolution I read over hastily, and it looks good. Probably we can leave any final revisions until the whole article is ready for final form. The scientific part, however, Father Herman and I read together and found problems. Basically, everything we want to say is there, and the tone is good. It's even a little too understated at times, but the meaning doesn't come through simple and clear, there being so many side questions, or rather, the side questions are not yet welded into the whole so as to leave one single convincing impression that evolution is philosophy and science has nothing to do with it, with a strong hint, which comes from just presenting the evidence itself, that the scientific evidence, if anything, is against evolution. Therefore, I will try to rethink and re-outline and rearrange the material and see if the meaning can be made somehow more transparent. As for the final patristic section, I am still compiling citations and making notes, hoping to get as broad an attack as possible on the question. I seem to recall that in Father P's tape he mentions the fact that the Saviour's genealogy back to Adam might contain some symbolical names, that is, that there might be whole gaps of hundreds or thousands of years. That's an important point. There is no doubt that the Holy Fathers regarded these names precisely as a list of fathers, but since no one ever doubted this before, they don't have many explicit statements on the subject. Incidentally, the Fathers were very concerned to reconcile the genealogy in Luke with that of Matthew, and the answer of Saint Gregory the Theologian and other Fathers is that the few differences in the two stem from the practice of the younger brother taking the older brother's wife to raise up offspring for him if he was childless, and one genealogy calls the father the one who was the real father, and the other takes the one for whom he was a father, so to speak. You might look in the scriptural index of any fathers you have and see if anyone comments on Luke chapter 3 verse 24. Footnote: In his notes, Father Seraphim translated a passage by the 11th century biblical commentator Blessed Theophilactus of Bulgaria concerning why Saint Luke the Evangelist carried the genealogy of Christ all the way back to Adam. The nativity of the Lord, as being without seed, encountered mistrust. Therefore, the evangelist, desiring to show that at another time also a man was produced without seed, ascends from the lower descendants up to Adam and God. As it were, he speaks thus: If you do not believe that the second Adam, Christ, was born without seed, then I beg you to turn in mind to the first Adam, and you will find that he was created by God without seed, and after this you will not be unbelieving. Quoted in the commentary on the Gospel of Luke by Bishop Michael, Kiev, 1899. After Father Seraphim's repose, a commentary on the Gospel of St. Luke by St. Ambrose of Milan came out in English translation. It contains an extensive discussion of the genealogy of Christ back to Adam. St. Ambrose of Milan, Exposition of the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, 1998. End of footnote. 20. The Larger Idea of Naturalism, to A.Y., February 14th, 27th, 1976. I myself would say that our basic framework of making references to popular and high school texts on evolution is the right one, for that is how it is taught and understood, and where the evolutionary philosophy comes through loud and clear. But it would be good to strengthen our position with more reference to sophisticated scientific sources to show we are aware that scientists don't believe everything they give the high school student, and even realize that much there comes from faith, but still have the basic evolutionary faith that the universe explains itself and can be understood in natural terms. I don't recall if we have made it clear anywhere yet that our argument is only secondarily against the particular theory of evolution and primarily against the larger idea of naturalism, that the universe explains itself. 21. Scientists who question evolution. To Dr. Alexander Kalomiros, February 22nd, March 6, 1976. We received your new letter on evolution. Now I do not know if it is possible to continue this discussion or not. You have placed me in a category. I am a fundamentalist, a literalist, I am against science and under Western influence. I am afraid that anything I may now say you will dismiss as of no value. If so, there is no point in my even replying to your letter. Your mind is already made up about me, and you will not listen to whatever I may say. I hope that this is not so, because you are the first Orthodox evolutionist I have found who is willing to discuss this question at all, and I think both of us could gain greatly by continuing this discussion. But I will have to tell you clearly that despite your impression, I am not a fundamentalist, nor am I against science, quite the contrary. But you are placing an impossible limitation to this discussion when you say, I would discuss evolution with you from the scientific point of view only if you had some diploma of one of the biological or geological branches of natural science. Since you wish it to be so, I of course can say nothing. But let me quote one of your scientific statements. The stages of the embryo in the uterus are exactly the stages of life's evolution upon Earth. This is so exact that even the gills of our ancient ancestors, the fishes, exist in the fetus of even the most perfected animals of the solid earth, the mammals. And now let me quote two statements made in scientific journals and textbooks by scientists possessing advanced degrees in their specialties. 1. Haeckel's recapitulation theory, which is exactly what you have described to me as an unquestioned scientific fact, has been demonstrated to be wrong by numerous subsequent scholars. Walter J. Bock, biologist of Columbia University, New York, in the article Evolution by Orderly Law in Science, Volume 164, May 4, 1969, page 684. 2. The type of analogical thinking that leads to theories that development is based on the recapitulation of ancestral stages or the like no longer seems at all convincing or even very interesting to biologists. Professor C. H. Waddington, University of Edinburgh, in Principles of Embryology, 1965, page 10. I do not bring these examples in order to debate this theory with you. I do so only in order to show you that something which you accept as undisputed scientific fact is not only disputed, but even denied by reputable scientists, many of whom are themselves evolutionists. The same is true of some other scientific facts which you cite and which you refuse to allow me to discuss with you. Despite your accusation, I am not against science. I do not have an advanced degree in science, but I have taken college courses in zoology and done considerable reading in scientific sources on the theory and facts of evolution. I have read the Life book on evolution and found it very disappointing because I hoped to find in it demonstrations of facts, because I am sincerely interested to know whether evolution is true or not, and instead I found only diagrams and pictures and descriptions which are not convincing to anyone with an open mind, but only to someone who already believes in evolution on other grounds. Your mind is evidently closed on this subject, and you seem to be unaware of the great mass of scientific literature in recent years, which is highly critical of the evolutionary theory, which talks about relegating it to poetry and metaphors instead of scientific theory. Professor Constance, professor of botany at the University of California, Berkeley, or even deny its validity altogether. If you wish, but it is quite pointless, I could indeed compile a list of hundreds, if not thousands, of reputable scientists who now either disbelieve in evolution entirely or state that it is highly questionable as a scientific theory. Many of them state quite openly, evidently Greece is still behind the West in this regard, that a literal creation in 6 24-hour days is one possible interpretation of the scientific facts which we now have. Although you will recall that I wrote in my first letter that this question is not one of the first importance, in my opinion. There is also now much scientific evidence that the world is no older than 8,000 to 10,000 years. I do not say that this is scientifically proved. I say only what scientists themselves now say, that there are some undisputed scientific facts which make sense only if the world is very young. Are you going to tell me that I am crazy or against science when I can quote doctors of geological and biological sciences, many of whom are not fundamentalists, who say things like this? If so, then there is no point discussing the issue further, because that would mean that you yourself are against science, are against an impartial and objective examination of scientific facts. I pray that this is not so, for then your views on evolution would be worthless, being only the creation of your own imagination. I do not wish to discuss in detail with you any of the scientific evidence for or against evolution. There are others who can do this much better than I. I only ask, to begin with, that you allow me to send you one book written by a scientific specialist, in geology I believe, who has given his views at lectures to geological societies here in America, that contains, in a rather balanced discussion, criticisms of the many weak points of the evolutionary theory. I do not agree with everything written there. It is on a somewhat popular college-age level, but it does give us a beginning for possible further discussion. Religion is not mentioned in this book, which discusses only scientific evidence. If you are willing to read this book, or at least some chapters of it which interest you, with a reasonably open scientific mind, then it will be possible to continue our discussion. 22. Avoiding One-sidedness. To A.Y. March 17th, 30th, 1976. I haven't gone back to Calomiro's letter and probably won't attempt a reply before summer. The letter, although I find its tone distasteful, is helpful because it shows the reaction that our evolution book would have had in some quarters if it hadn't first been tested by this correspondence. This will help us to avoid one-sidedness. I have the impression Calomiros demonstrates quite a bit of rationalism himself. He writes not as from within a tradition himself, but as one who is striving to get into the tradition. Our uninterrupted Russian tradition, for all its real and supposed Westernisms, has a strength and resiliency which the rediscoverers of tradition do not have. May God help us to express these things in a way that can be accepted and assimilated today. 23. 3 Axioms. To Father I, July 3rd, 16th, 1977. About evolution, we were glad to have your comments. If you really want to see them so much, and Dr. Calomiros has already distributed his letters, we could send you copies after we've made our reply to his second letter. But really, this correspondence has not been very fruitful at all. At first, we were encouraged by the fact that he was willing to discuss the matter at all, which few Orthodox seem to want to do, and we responded to him in a tone that we thought was roughly the same as his own, not fearing to be corrected on any mistakes we might make, but hoping that, although starting almost poles apart, we might in the end work out this question in friendly debate and come rather close together by the end of it. But we see now that our reply seems only to have offended him. Perhaps, most of all, he disliked our strong implication that he is probably just as much under Western influence as the rest of us poor mortals, and his second letter offers almost no chance for an extension of the debate. Our reply will probably be short whenever we get a chance even for that, and we'll have to begin by pointing out some of the contradictions he has fallen into himself, with little hope of even getting him interested in some of the more basic questions which, as I recall, haven't even been mentioned yet by either of us. But for now, leaping at the chance to chew this question a little more, I will only give you a few of my own observations, not on evolution itself, but on the approach to it, which seems so difficult but is so essential. First of all, we were very disappointed in all the 3B letters on the subject which we have seen. There is very little there that we would disagree with, save for the flippant tone in some places, but they never really get to the question of evolution at all, and they are certainly not the orthodox answer or approach to the question which Father E had promised to give. In fact, these letters reveal a distinct attempt not to approach the question at all, but rather to stay above it with a rather superior air. Symptomatic is Father E's confession, either there or elsewhere, that he has never read Teilhard de Chardin and doesn't need to, as also his evident ignorance of the whole scientific side of the question. The funny cartoon he included has nothing to do with any new findings, for example, but was old news 80 years ago. Likewise, with Dr. Calomiros, he prides himself on knowing nothing at all of Western teachings on evolution, apart from what he regards as scientific facts, and insists that we pay attention only to what he teaches on the subject, which is patristic. 1. This brings us to axiom number 1 in our approach to the question, not the most important one, but first in order of discussion. The question of evolution can't be discussed at all if one doesn't have a basic grasp of the scientific side of it, the scientific proofs of evolution, as well as the broader philosophy of evolution based on it, Teilhard de Chardin, etc. This is precisely what the B fathers seem to be afraid of, and in general our Orthodox theologians also, including Father Michael Pomazansky, if I'm not mistaken. Once you get into science, the theologian is out of his depth, there are endless fruitless debates, etc. I think this is why Dr. Calomiros' evolution articles in the Greek religious press stirred up uneasiness but no distinct protests, because theologians in general just don't know how to handle the scientific side. By this, I don't mean that one has to be a scientific specialist in order to discuss the scientific side of the question. The scientific side is not the most important one, and specialists usually trip themselves up by concentrating too much on it. But if one isn't sufficiently aware of the scientific side, one won't be able to grasp the question in its full scope. One can't say with assurance, for example, whether man has been on earth some 7,000 or 8,000 years, more or less, as the fathers often say, if one is totally ignorant of the principles of radiometric dating, geologic strata, etc., which prove that man is millions of years old. And such knowledge is not esoteric at all. The basic principles of radiometric dating, enough to show its strong and weak points, can be explained in a rather short article. And the question of whether man has been on earth for some thousands of years or some millions of years is one that certainly touches on some basic orthodox questions, whether the genealogies of the scripture are actually genealogies, as all the fathers certainly believed, or just sketchy lists with many long blanks in them. Whether some of the patriarchs of the Old Testament, if these are not genealogies, might not be symbols instead of concrete people. Whether Adam himself ever existed, especially in view of what seems the prevailing theory now among evolutionists, polygenism, that new species begin in many pairs simultaneously, etc. This is just a sample to show that to get anywhere in this question, one must have a basic layman's awareness of the scientific evidences for and against evolution. If one is reasonably objective and not out to prove one's point at any cost, such questions need not arouse passionate debates. As a basic principle, of course, we must assume that scientific truth, as opposed to various opinions and prejudices, cannot contradict revealed truth if only we understand them both correctly. Your point to start with basic theological principles, I think, is good, and these should always be fundamental, and one must always be well aware of the different modes of knowledge and not mix them up. The trouble is, the question of evolution is so complex that one isn't always aware which aspect of it has ceased to be scientific and has intruded on theology or philosophy, or exactly where the real conflicts arise. There, I think it is very important as a second axiom. 2. To be aware of the basic philosophies underlying or derived from evolutionism and various other views of origins. The evolutionary philosophy of up from the beast certainly seems irreconcilable with the Christian view of fall from paradise, and our whole view of history will certainly be determined by which way we believe. The Catholics used to solve this problem with a deus ex machina. When the body had evolved sufficiently, God specially created a soul for it. There, evolution is correct, and so is Genesis, broadly interpreted. Calomiros has basically the same view, though he has a more patristic vocabulary to describe it, but such views are very artificial and contrived. The Christians wait for the latest evolutionary hypothesis and twist the text of Genesis to fit in with it. This won't do. An awareness of how evolutionary philosophers such as Teilhard de Chardin view the whole question of evolution, while it may not solve any specific question, will still give a broader view of the whole intellectual background behind evolution. 3. Axiom 3. The whole question of Genesis cannot be well approached by Orthodox people without appealing to the basic Orthodox sources, the Holy Fathers. Especially valuable, the Hexamera of Saint Basil and Saint Ambrose, commentaries on Genesis by Saint John Chrysostom and Saint Ephrem the Syrian, homilies on Adam, paradise, and the first created world by Saint Simeon the New Theologian, especially homily 45 in the Théophane de Reclus edition of 1892, Saint Gregory the Sinite in the Russian Philokalia, Saint Abba Dorotheus, Instruction 1, commentaries of various fathers on related passages of Scripture, for example Romans chapter 8 verses 19 to 22, concerning the vanity or corruption of the post-Adamic world, or Saint Gregory the Theologian on the Genealogies of Christ. Homilies on the subject of the resurrection, or whenever the question of seed or growth is discussed. Treatise on the origin of man, Saint Gregory of Nyssa. Patristic discussions on reincarnation and the pre-existence of souls, which are philosophically related to the question of evolution, etc. About Dr. Calomiros, our second reply to him will point out where we think he went astray in his patristic interpretations, but our general impression of his two letters which we won't write him directly for fear of offending him again, is this. 1. He is very unprepared to discuss the question either scientifically or philosophically. He is unaware of Western discussions of the subject and is only concerned to stand superior to them, which one can't do if one isn't aware of them. It is abundantly obvious from his 2 letters that he, and probably Greek scientists in general, is far behind the West, and he is holding to scientific and philosophical positions long abandoned or in process of revision by Western scientists themselves. As one example, his defense of Haeckel's recapitulation theory of the human embryo. Today's evolutionary textbooks of embryology dismiss it as a 19th century fantasy, but Kalomiros not only clings to it as an obvious proof of evolution, but even forbids us to discuss any scientific questions with him until we get advanced degrees in the physical sciences, a typical refuge of someone who doesn't want a free discussion of the subject. He is not aware either of the less dogmatic spirit which many evolutionary scientists now have, nor of the immense number of scientists with advanced degrees who now have abandoned evolution entirely or are skeptical of it. 2. He is theologically unprepared for such a discussion, something which surprised us most of all. Even after promising us that he was going to reply only after reading all the basic patristic texts on the subject, he still bases his whole argument on 2 or 3 patristic texts, very one-sidedly interpreted, and does not even answer a number of our patristic citations, which are only a small part of the patristic passages we have found. His Saint Gregory of Nyssa quote says nothing whatever of evolution unless you read it into the passage, and the Saint Seraphim quote certainly does not sustain his interpretation, wherein he does precisely what he accused us of doing, taking chronologically words which are ontological in reference. When I say that Dr. Kalomiros is unprepared, I do not of course mean that he is incapable of discussing the question, merely that he is so prejudiced in advance, with a complex about being inferior to Western wisdom, that he does not view the question at all objectively. I quoted Saint Ephraim's very fundamentalistic view that the 6 days were 24 hours long without precisely agreeing with him, and Dr. Kalomiros dismissed it by saying he was using the science of his time. But since the science of Saint Ephraim's time most certainly did not teach that the world was created in 6 24-hour days, with 12 hours between each creative moment, I can only assume that Dr. Kalomiros is not prepared to examine patristic evidence very objectively, using any excuse to dismiss whatever doesn't agree with his own views. I would strongly suspect that Father Mikhail Pomazansky would prefer not to make any general comments on the question of evolution. However, if you gave him specific questions touching on theology, you might get answers, but then again, he might be so afraid of the scientific side that he might hesitate even here. This letter is already too long. Unfortunately, I just won't have time for some while to set down the patristic quotes I have found up to now. But sometime perhaps I will get the time. You might be interested in some of the publications of the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, especially books like Scientific Creationism, Public School, that is, non-religious edition, which present only scientific evidence without reference to religion. Their presentation of the creation model is a promising approach to a more objective view of the whole question. Their religious views, of course, suffer from the general short-sightedness of fundamentalism, in particular their unawareness of the whole patristic field of commentary on Genesis. But most Orthodox people have a similar lack of awareness. I'm enclosing 2 of their pamphlets with their address so you can order some of their books if you want. I would like to keep up this discussion a little at a time if you wish to. 24. Notes from a Dialogue on Evolution to Father I, August 8, 21st, 1977. A few notes on our continuing dialogues on evolution. Many thanks for your 2 letters. 1. The question of the age of the earth is a question raised by science, which cannot give it a completely satisfactory answer, and touching on revelation and certain theological questions. From the point of view of biblical interpretation, this question is dependent on a more fundamental one, the age of mankind. Here the text of Genesis does not need to fear the evidence of science, and since modern science does talk about this, we have to have an intelligent answer to the opinion concerning the millions of years during which supposedly not merely galaxies have existed, but even man himself and his near ancestors have been walking on earth. One cannot escape the question of the existence of man in chronological time, since both Genesis with its patristic interpreters and science seem to be talking about the same kind of years we know, by reference to the formation of galaxies and the relativity of time. The primordial galaxies themselves are a product of the scientific speculations of modern thinkers, and neither more nor less deserving of credence than ancient Greek speculations concerning the origin of the world. 2. This raises another fundamental question. How much should we use science in a commentary on Genesis? I would say, as a very minimum. We must know enough about science and its modern speculations to have an answer to those who use it to disprove Genesis. Thus, its chief function today is perhaps negative. But beyond that, I think our attitude should be that of Saint Basil in his Hexameron. The legitimate conclusions of science should be used whenever they help the task of interpreting the sacred text. The science phobia which has been caused among some Orthodox Christians by the false use of science on the part of anti-Christians should be overcome. In the case of evolution, I don't see how the question can be discussed at all without a basic knowledge of the scientific proofs for and against. I don't mean we should become passionately attached to them or place them on the same level as theology. We should just be aware of them and know how to assess their relative value. The scientific creationists are very useful in this regard because they have hunted up evidence which had been selectively disregarded by predisposed evolutionists. For example, the remarkable evidence of an Earth under 10,000 years old, which must definitely be weighed against the evidence for an Earth much older, etc. 3. But is the question of the age of the human race, some 7,000 or 8,000 years versus a million or more years, really theological or important? You doubt whether it is. I offer 2 observations. A. The Holy Fathers probably unanimously, certainly have no doubt that the chronology of the Old Testament, from Adam onwards, is to be accepted literally. They did not have the fundamentalists over-concerned for chronological precision, but even the most mystical fathers, Saint Isaac the Syrian, Saint Gregory Palamas, etc., were quite certain that Adam lived literally some 900 years, that there were some 5,500 years, more or less, between the creation and the birth of Christ, etc. Blessed Augustine has a good discussion as to the differences between the Greek and Hebrew chronologies. The 1,000 years, more or less, didn't bother him any more than it did other fathers, but the assertion that Adam lived 1,000,000 or more years ago, and that thus the Old and New Testament chronology is quite arbitrary or fanciful, could not but have evoked numerous patristic discussions. Can we be so trusting of the conclusions of modern science, especially if we have a basic knowledge of radiometric dating procedures and the philosophy underlying them, as to totally overturn the patristic opinion? Dr. Calomiros and other Orthodox evolutionists say we should, without a second thought. I would say this is dangerous presumption and an intrusion of dubious science into the realm of revealed truth. When Dr. Calomiros dismisses the patristic interpretation of the Old Testament chronology as Jewish rationalism, I even begin to wonder what his basic attitude to the fathers is. It seems to have an element of disrespect, to say the least. B. More important, more theological. One's picture of reality, of the world, definitely influences one's view of God. I offer you, very briefly, two pictures or models of man and his world. 1. Man created some 7,000, 8,000 years ago, separately from other creatures, not descended from others, dispassionate by nature in soul and body, with Eve miraculously created from his rib, in a way we cannot describe with scientific precision, as St. John Chrysostom indicates, in a world of creatures with natures basically stable and not in process of becoming other natures. Much could be said on separate details of this picture, and knowledge of many of the details can never be precise, but basically it does not contradict the text of Genesis and is harmonious with the Orthodox view of God. 2. Man descended from lower creatures, passionate by his origin and nature, becoming dispassionate in paradise, when grace brought him out of his bestial state, according to Calomiros, at a moment very hazy both chronologically and theologically. Today, Roman Catholic evolutionists deny paradise altogether because they can't reconcile it with evolutionary philosophy. Existing in his fallen state perhaps 1,000,000 or more years, during which time he gradually came up from savagery to civilization, the record of him in the Old Testament being extremely sketchy and not to be taken seriously when it speaks of years. The world around man being in a constant state of change and ascent from one nature to another, and this whole process being explainable, more or less, by science, except for the original impulse of creation itself, which produced a rather undifferentiated mass with the potentiality of all future developments. Calomiros insists there is nothing miraculous about the 6 days of creation. They all proceeded according to scientific laws. This picture, that of theistic or God-guided evolution, can be reconciled with the text of Genesis and its patristic interpretation only by means of many jumps and improvisations and wholesale disregard of patristic evidence. The chief reason, I suspect, why it does not give the horrors to Orthodox believers in God-guided evolution, as for example Father N professed himself to be, is simply because they put their heads in the sand and don't bother to think about it at all because of a very unhealthy science phobia. But my point here is not one's view of God basically affected by such a picture of the world? For example, the view of an Orthodox evolutionist like Theodosius Dobzhansky in his address on receiving an honorary doctorate from St. Vladimir's Seminary utterly denies the providence of God in the world. His God is the deist God. Saint John Damascene, following Saint Gregory of Nyssa and others, states that it is unworthy of God to believe that he created man's body and soul in separate moments, as if he did not have power for the whole act at once. This act of creation was simultaneous. Here, the text of Genesis is not to be interpreted literally or chronologically. Calomiros specifically denies this. His interpretation of Saint Seraphim's words would collapse otherwise. How much less worthy of God then to believe that he created only some kind of material ocean of potentiality and left everything to evolve by itself according to natural laws. All this, as you can see, is an informal discussion presented for your reflection. Precise citations will have to be given when I have time. 25. Clergy in Greece against Orthodox Evolutionism. To Bishop Gregory, November 22nd, December 5th, 1980. In the 1981 conference in Pennsylvania, I noticed that Dr. Alexander Kalomiros will be speaking on the creation of man and the world, and I greatly fear that his talk and his very presence will only promote the spirit of criticism which is poisoning our church so much. I myself had a lengthy correspondence with Dr. Kalomiros some years ago on the subject of creation and evolution, and I discovered to my astonishment that he is an adherent of the most naive kind of evolutionism. He wrote that Adam could well have had the face of an ape because he was at first an ape-like creature to whom God gave his spirit, and that he is most doctrinaire and arrogant in upholding his opinions. He refused to discuss any scientific evidence with me because I have no doctor's degree in science, and when I criticized some of his opinions and showed that some of his scientific evidence is outdated and is no longer accepted even by evolutionary textbooks in the West, he broke off the correspondence with me. Dr. Kalomiros' opinions on creation have been greatly criticized by conservative clergy in Greece, and theologically, in his correspondence with me, he had very shaky and superficial grounds for upholding his scientific evolutionism. In addition, Dr. Kalomiros has now made himself notorious in Greece for starting his own schism from the old calendarists over the issue of the icon of the Trinity, showing God the Father as an old man. He insists the icon is heretical and justifies the breaking of communion with those who venerate or even tolerate it. 26. People are ready to hear this. To Father A.Y., Mid-Fair Saturday, 1981. Thinking about my Genesis course this summer, I was rereading part of Dr. Kalomiros' letters. How discouraging. One loses all inspiration to get tangled up in this subject, seeing how he handles it. And really, The tone is just like Deacon L's. I wondered why, and Father Herman answered me, "They're trying to keep up with the advanced fashions in the universities." And I think that's probably really the answer. Especially Calomiro's repeated insistence. Deacon L says the same thing, over how many have lost their souls because of literal interpretations of Genesis. That is, we have to give them Genesis on their level, changing the truth if need be, so as not to offend them or give them more than they can chew. But anyone who is really converted to Christianity will surely begin to rethink his whole intellectual outlook, won't he? Isn't the real problem that Dr. Calomiros, Deacon L, and others are intellectuals who haven't been fully converted or have brought their intellectual baggage with them into orthodoxy, the same thing they accuse others of? This was the disease of the Russian intellectual converts earlier in this century, and I think our Greeks fall into the same category. Therefore, I am plowing ahead with Genesis according to the Holy Fathers, realizing that it may cause more waves among the Greeks and name-calling, but I'm already a theosophist and can't get much worse than that, especially since it will be competition to Dr. Calomiro's talk in Pennsylvania. Speaking of Genesis, I see no reason why this course on Genesis couldn't be turned into the main portion of our long-lost evolution book. The whole outline of it now becomes clear to me. It should be called something positive, no evolution in the title, such as Genesis, Creation, and Early Man, an Orthodox view. And the first and main part should be simply an Orthodox interpretation, according to Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Ephraim, etc., of the first chapters of Genesis, discussing problems raised by modern men in the course of the discussion. Then, as the secondary thought, less than half the book, a discussion of the whole question of evolution. If we can carry it through, it should be a pioneering work which will make this question at least discussable among Orthodox Christians, many of whom are concerned but just don't know where to begin to think it through. What do you think? Any ideas or discussions? I will be working on the whole first part for the summer course, and maybe you and I could look over and organize the rest of it sometime this summer. Then it will be timely to print it, especially since the subject will be somewhat in the air with my and Calomiro's talks. Rereading Calomiro's letters, I see that there is something quite basic at stake. It is obvious that Calomiros has no intention whatever to humble himself before the mind of the Fathers. He knows better than they, and therefore he easily categorizes as absurd opinions which they held because he himself has thought it out better with the aid of modern science. In this case, he is broader than the Fathers. In most cases, perhaps, our Greeks are narrower, but it is their own wisdom that they trust and which they wish to impose on others. Our key is sticking to the wisdom of the Church, trusting our own Fathers and the Holy Fathers who lived before. People are ready to hear this.